This is part 2 of Dr. Renato Leem's study. This time he's going to focus on the New Testament, the first chapter of Romans. And this is our Bishop Peter Hickman. And the event is being sponsored by St. Matthew ECC Church and St. Junia's House. So we will now start.
And we're happy to have you join with us and you continue viewing this. I think you will find the insights and your understanding of the scriptures really come alive. This has been a great series and we're so happy to sponsor this and to place it on YouTube for your enjoyment.
Hello again. We are now, well, thank you for being here first of all. I would like to draw attention to what happens at some academic conferences after lunch. Those who are awarded time to give papers right after lunch, they call it the graveyard slot. And it has something to do with dropping eyelids. So, but I won't take it personally if any eyelids start dropping in this room. There's a lot of information coming to begin to drop. The good news is that the final session will be more interactive.
Could we possibly have some air conditioning in here? That will help keep the eyes from drooping, especially on
Right.
I don't want to droop.
Right.
Meat lockers.
All right. So, we are now going to hop elegantly and easily from the Hebrew Scriptures, where we have looked at one text that is irrelevant in the sense of not relevant for same-sex relationship, was found. But we did find a lot of other very interesting concerns expressed through that text. So now we're going to move to the other parts of Scripture in the Christian tradition, what I call the Second Testament. It's often referred to as the New Testament, but I prefer the terms first and second rather than old and new. And one of the main texts that are being quoted, one that is being quoted often, is the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. And there are many reasons for that, all of which are irrelevant to our subject. But anyway, let us go in there to see then what's going on. I'm dividing this into 6 parts. An introduction, then looking at verse 1:26. Secondly, at Romans 1:27. Then I'm talking about a few voices that are crying in the desert. And finally, summarize and draw some conclusions. Let's go to the introduction. You may not be surprised to hear that I'm relying heavily on the work expressed in this book by Dr. Renato Leem. Now, in Christian theology, this was a surprise to me when I first heard it. The letter to the Romans has been the object of more studies and commentaries than any other part of the Bible. How about that? Is that impressive?
No.
So at least that's a good reason for looking at it. Now, let me also hasten to add that I didn't choose the font for Christian tradition. The machine did. But it's a major issue in Christian tradition that according to what theologians have thought for a long time, Paul condemns in this letter sexual interaction between two persons of the same sex. One of many who have mentioned this is a famous theologian from the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas. According to Thomas, sexual intercourse for procreation is what is natural. If you want to produce a baby, you have natural sex. All other and any other sexual activity is unnatural because it doesn't lead to procreation. So it doesn't really, I mean, there's a huge debate among scholars what's natural and unnatural and nature and against nature, etc., etc. Enormous. I feel, at least in the Middle Ages, it's a lot simpler than that. This is basically what we're talking about. Martin Luther then, the Reformation, I brought him in earlier, did he then change anything in that regard? Well, not really. According to Martin Luther, divine law mandates that males join with females. Okay? And so, from that perspective, sex between males is against nature and even a monstrous depravity. So, Roman Catholic tradition and Protestant tradition have a lot in common here.
That is specifically sex between males, not sex between females.
Yes, he just addressed that. That's why that's why I was saying sex between males. But you know, it's kind of, Christian tradition is kind of unsettled about the thing about females. But certainly from the 13th century onwards, some theologians have included female same-sex relations in the concept of sodomy. So there's a lot. I mean, people are writing, you know, dense studies about this because there's a lot to say about it. But I'm just really giving you the tip of the iceberg here. So when we look at the consequences of this, because we can say this is of academic interest, but so unfortunately it isn't. It has been shown that even for the Nazis in the 20th century, they found it was quite logical to include gay people and those who had to be sent to concentration camps and death camps. Because after all, they were practicing unnatural sex. And they felt, you know, there's this justification for it in Christian tradition. And certainly, if you look to Romans 1:32, which is another verse, the final verse of that chapter, what the people Paul is talking about here, he's saying that they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. And then, as you can probably guess from here, those things have been taken to mean same-sex relations. But is it really? That is what we're going to look at now.
A couple slides back under Luther,
Yeah.
he mentions divine law.
Divine law mandates, yes.
Referring to a particular law or an assumptive law.
I can't remember the details surrounding this quote. I take it he's taken it definitely from Genesis. So he may be referring back to his understanding of the creation story.
Oh, okay.
That is my suggestion there. Yes, because this quote from Luther is taken out of his sermons on Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And the command he's referring to, I would think, would be the first command, be fruitful and multiply.
Probably. Probably.
That's the first command.
Yes, that's correct. So we have the dire consequences now of this tradition showing. So that we have all kinds of reasons for going into this text and actually looking at it. And as late as 2007, and it's happening as I speak also in many parts of the world, we have this quote from an evangelical minister in Uganda, and he's referring to Romans 1, saying that gay people and those who support them deserve to die. And Uganda has acted on that, as some of you probably know. It was quite a lot in the media a while ago.
There's a movie on YouTube called I Love Uganda.
God loves Uganda.
And God knows, maybe it is God.
Oh, I'm sorry, maybe we're talking about two different movies.
Same thing.
Okay, well, the one I've seen is called God Loves You Again.
God loves you, God. Anyway, it's a documentary about what actually transpired there, how the American fundamentalists got in there and really influenced
Yes,
the situation. It's a powerful, powerful
Very.
documentary.
it's very well made, and thought-provoking, and an eye-opener too. So, the question then is, what is Paul actually saying in Romans 1, given all of this drama? Let's go into the text now and look at Romans 1. And as you can see from the title, what if Paul is inclusive? I am suggesting a rather different approach than the one that traditionally has been taken. I want to come at the text from a different angle. Now, let's look at the language, first of all, in which Paul wrote. We are writing one language or another. It may have looked something like this, and if you go to it close up and analyze it, you will see, yes, this is Greek. Greek is a language in which the New Testament letters and Gospels, etc., were all written. So we're now going to focus on those two verses that are very often quoted, verses 26 and 27. I'm going to take them separately because each verse has its own complexities. And as you probably gathered from our discussion of Sodom and Gomorrah earlier, I am a person, I wouldn't say of complexity, well maybe I am, but certainly for looking at complexities in the Bible because there's a lot of them. So let's look at now verse 26. This is an approximately literal translation I've tried to figure out. Because of this, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Okay. Their females exchanged the natural use for that which is unnatural. It could also be translated against nature, beside nature, or beyond nature. All of this may be implied. So you take your pick. Now, what is characteristic about this text? I'm going to suggest a little literary analysis. Let's look at the text. What is there? How do the words work? Maybe through that we can see what situation is being described. Because at least to me, dishonorable passions, I don't know how clear that is to you. I have some doubts. And the natural use for that which is unnatural is not exactly what I would call contemporary English, is it? So anyway, let's look at the situation here, the literary situation. First of all, note this. Too many commentators sort of don't even, it doesn't register with them. But look at Paul saying, God gave them up. Their females exchanged. Past tense is referring back to an event that happened some time ago. Do you see what I mean? It's very clear in the Greek, the aorist tense is past tense, referring to events that have happened and refer to a specific moment in time. Then there's this other expression. I mean, we could spend time looking at a lot of words. Just also note, I haven't highlighted it, but look under B, their females exchanged. He doesn't say the females. So it's a certain group of women, their women. The guy who's going to take is their women who exchanged something in the past. So now what about this natural versus unnatural? Well, the commentators will tell you that natural in this context, in Paul's day, often meant what is expected or what is usual, what is conventional, what we all would expect in that situation. That's called natural. And the unnatural is the opposite. the unexpected, the unconventional, the unusual. That's one meaning of it. And then, already at this time, the natural use, I think this is characteristic. It's just not natural. The word use means a certain situation, a certain function is being suggested here. And sure enough, when you look at the sources and other sources than Paul, you begin to realize, they're probably referring to heterosexual vaginal intercourse to ensure procreation. This is considered natural in these philosophical schools. So we have now unnatural use in Paul and other sources. Often means sexual acts that are unnecessary for reproduction. And these ideas live on and become part of the cultural baggage of the Church Fathers. We have an interesting early witness to this text. In Clement of Alexandria, he wrote and spoke in Greek. So he was able to read Paul in the original language.
I'll go back on the slide. We
What's
lost
that?
You had it come up there on the slide and now it moved.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Right. So we have Clement there, writing and reading in Greek, interpreting Paul in the original language. And according to Clement, he's suggesting something interesting. We have this group of women who exchange the natural use, which would be the typical position, if you like, for procreative purposes. They have exchanged it for something different. And he feels rather than offering the men their front, they have offered them their backside. So this is one of the earliest witnesses we have, which is an interesting idea, isn't it? And why is it unnatural? Well, because it doesn't lead to procreation. Then we fast forward 2,000 years to today's churches. They will tell you that Paul is, I'm now saying churches, I mean, I should admit many churches, telling you that Paul is referring to all women who practice lesbian love, which is not exactly the same point that Clement was making. So a lot has happened in the intervening centuries, we must say. Historically, there's definitely a major shift in interpretation. We can see that. We also hear today in many commentaries that Romans 1:26 is the only text that is supposed to condemn love between two women. This is in fact the only reference in the entire Bible that says something negative about intimate relations between two women, supposedly. Okay? Because as we've already seen, there's some ambiguity here. So, but what is important to stress, this is indeed the only text we can muster if we want to discuss same-sex relations between women in negative terms. Now, the problem with these modern interpretations, of which there are many, they ignore that the Greek is held in the past tense, as I was saying earlier. This is quite essential. If you want to read an ancient text, look at what tense is it writing. Is he writing in present tense or in past tense or what? So that you can see what context is he addressing. He's addressing the past, or past events. And this is ignored many times. Also, it's based on much later Christian tradition. And even more importantly, for me at least, when you read the whole letter to the Romans that Paul wrote, you'll see he has some very strong theological concerns through the letter that emerge later. And if you give the traditional interpretation to Romans 1, you lose sight of the other major concerns he's expressing later on. So, let's go to the other verse now. We've talked a bit about women, and we've seen some ambiguity here, and it was all held in the past tense. Let's look at 127. It says, in the same way the males, leaving aside the natural use of women, here we have the natural use again, were inflamed in passion for each other, committing indecency male with male, receiving in themselves the just retribution for their error. Now, it's not obvious to many of us, at least at first sight, the natural use, but we talked about that, the possible meaning of it. In passion for each other, committing indecency male with male. Well, perhaps there's some orgy being implied here somewhere. Receiving in themselves the just retribution for their error. This error is interesting word. And the just retribution. It's not quite clear either what exactly, in what way are they being punished, right? But it's just, that's certainly being said. Okay. So, to what situation is Paul exactly referring here? We have, if we apply a literary analysis, we have the expression the natural use of women, and we have were inflamed, again past tense, worth noting, and their error, that did something that they weren't intended or meant to do. Let's look at now at how it's being translated and interpreted today. I'm going to look at two English versions that give slightly different wordings, just to highlight the difficulties. Could pick many others. I've taken the Revised English Bible, and I've taken the New Life Version. If we take the Revised English Bible, looking at this verse 27, they say, and men too, giving up natural relations with women, burn with lust for one another. Males behave indecently with males and are paid in their own persons the fitting wage of such perversion. What ideas come to mind for you when you compare with the literal translation?
Well, they lost the aorist tense. It's not in the past tense.
That's right.
And put it in the present continuous.
It is in the present, as if it were happening this minute.
It's an ongoing.
Exactly. So there's a major difference there. Do you like the word perversion?
They like that.
They obviously like that, yeah.
Instead of error, it's now perversion.
Right. So there's a bit of a gap between the two words, isn't there? So this is the Revised English Bible, which in some circles is very respected, but I have probably some of their choices here. So what they're doing, as we're saying, they're updating the story using present tense. And some words I would consider unsuitable because it's not what Paul is talking about. He's talking about an error, somebody who commits an error. He's not saying perversion, which belongs to a different category, at least in my dictionary. So let's go to the New Life Version. In the same way, men left the right use of women's bodies. They did sex sins with other men. They received for themselves the punishment that was coming to them for their sin. Now, at least we could say one thing in his favor. Past tense, right? So they got that right. The past tense is there, they left and they received. So far so good. But the problem, I don't know, I highlighted some in red to help you a little bit along. But I guess you will agree with me that sin and error is not necessarily the same thing, is it? At least it isn't for me. Error is when you make a mistake. Sin is when you're breaking a rule or doing something serious, which you're not supposed to do. Would you agree? So, the word sin, and it's listed twice. So there's a strong emphasis on something sinful going on here. So yes, the past tense is in place, but the other stuff raises questions. Where did they get all this sin from? If it's not in the Greek. Because the Greek has words for sin. Paul uses them elsewhere, but it's not here. Do you see what I mean? So if the translators were in this room, we had a few questions to answer them. Right? So, in the New Life Version, we find the language, I would call it inaccurate. The word sin doesn't really belong here. And it's pretty colloquial. I don't know, maybe it's even one of those easy to read versions. I haven't double checked. But it almost sounds like it, doesn't it? It was common to them, sex scriptures and so on.
You didn't get it.
Yes, very good. So, obviously some English versions are sending a clear message to today's readers. Bible is clear and unambiguous with regard to homosexuality. We all know that, don't we? Well, that has been the tenor of many, many contributions to this debate. This book, as we already realized, starts in a different place and goes somewhere else. People will tell you, oh, Paul and the Bible is strongly condemning homosexual relationships. Right? We've all heard that. The main champion of this approach among academics is Robert Gagnon, the Presbyterian scholar who published a book in 2001 called The Bible and Homosexual Practice. You can almost tell from the title which way he's headed. And he's very, very active, and a couple of years ago I visited his website, and there he has his gallery of favorite enemies. You know,
One yet?
pardon? I haven't double checked recently to see if he's notified. Maybe I can never choose. To be honest, if I am, I would feel proud. I would be in pretty good company.
Yeah.
Because he's got a long gallery, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and lots of other interesting people in there. Desmond Tutu, you know, they're all, so why not? This is Robert Gagnon. He's sort of the main exponent of that line we've just been looking at. And he's all over the Bible, making connections here and there and everywhere. It's an interesting book, but maybe for some of us not terribly edifying. So here I put a little pause. We don't hold it now. We can move on, unless somebody is wishing for a pause at this stage. Okay. Now, we've looked at the text, we've looked at the translations, we've looked at their interpretations. Now, is that all there is to say? Well, no, there isn't. And some people actually have spoken out in different ways. I call them voices crying in the desert. First one I mentioned is Dr. Thomas Hanks. He founded an organization called Other Sheep. I'm involved in that for Other Sheep Europe. He himself is from the USA, Presbyterian, lives in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He has a lot to say on Romans. He spent years studying Romans. So he's suggesting, if you want to understand the whole letter, and particularly this verse, read the whole letter, right? Because you have to see everything in their context. So he's saying, why don't you start backwards? Begin at the very back, read chapter 16, and then work your way 15, 14, 13, etc. When you get to chapter 1, you'll get the perspective. Paul is applying here. Because too many people read a chunk of chapter 1 and then stop, and they don't see the remaining 15 chapters. So he's saying, do the other bit, and then you get a much clearer vision of where Paul is really at with the whole letter. And Titus next is emphasizing that Paul, throughout the letter, really is discussing oppression and how that is countered by God's liberating justice. That's the main point of the letter for Thomas Paine. Unrelated to the film actor, by the way. He never fails to mention that. And also points out that he's a few years older, so he calls himself the original Thomas Paine. Roman Catholic scholar James Allison from Britain, brilliant writer. I took one in a seminar years ago. I didn't even know he would be there. He appeared by surprise, but I was very taken by James Allison. Very bright mind, great stuff to read. And James proposes a few things when you want to study this text. Don't forget that in the original manuscript there was no division into chapters. You had a scroll, and it was the continual. It's a much more recent invention, dividing everything up into chapters and verses. Because we need that for our own comfort, right? So we know where we are. But that is not there in the original. So James is reading chapter 1 in direct connection with what comes after, what we now call chapter 2. He's reading them as one piece. You will only understand chapter 1 if you also read chapter 2. Otherwise, you're missing all the main points. Now, and according to James Allison, Paul is using this vitriolic discourse, which it actually is in chapter 1. It's pretty nasty stuff. He's using it as a rhetorical trap to catch judgmental Jewish readers in Rome who would like this stuff. They would like to discuss idolatry. Yeah. We believe in the one true God. So, according to James, this is what Paul is setting up a trap.
Yes.
By letting these things, these juicy observations stay in the air. The Jews, they'll be glued onto this. And then he will spring the trap on them in chapter 2. Ha! Gotcha. And another thing that many commentators have ignored completely, that Paul is citing the Book of Wisdom.
Yes.
Book of Wisdom goes on and on and on about idolatry, and has very bad things to say about idolaters. Many of Paul's commentaries are, if not direct, almost direct quotation from the Book of Wisdom, was written in Greek. So there's a strong resonance between the Book of Wisdom and Romans 1. So these are some of the important points that James Allison is raising. Then there's another person called Jeremy Townsley. I have not met him personally, unlike the other two. But Townsley is bringing in yet more information. He's underscoring the fact that we're talking about idolatry here. Romans 1 is about idolatry. Okay? And don't forget, and James Allison also mentioned this, that Rome in Paul's day had more than 400 different temples dedicated to different deities. Small wonder that he's discussing idolatry when he's writing to Rome. And then another thing that I was not aware of when I began this, but the very fact that this text is held in the past tense kind of makes sense with what comes here. That the past tense is referring to scandalous events that took place in the first century before the Christian era in two temples in particular, namely that of Bacchus and the other one of Cybele. Some pretty dramatic stuff was happening there. There were orgies and pretty wild. So wild when in the case of the Bacchus temple that the Roman Senate prohibited it and punished some of their leaders by executing them. That reminds me of Paul in 132, people who practice deserve to die. There were events well worth writing about, but mostly commentators ignore this. They don't even bring this in. But I feel it's important to mention it as another option to look at it, this text. Final voice crying in the desert. Very little known, which is unfortunate, But I think the reason why he's very little known, Douglas Campbell, he published a book in 2009, I believe it was, or was it 2011? Can't remember exactly. But anyway, he published a book that is even heavier than this one. So I think that's one reason why so few people dare to go there. But somebody drew my attention to it. I think actually it was Thomas Hanks. But anyway, I then got a copy of Douglas Campbell. I think it's 1,100 pages. So he's done a respectable job there. And he spent years reading Paul. Years. So what he's saying, and he's adding even more points to the one we've just been raising. He agrees with James Allison and others that Paul is citing the Book of Wisdom. That is clear enough. But Douglas Campbell goes a step further. He's saying Paul is not quoting it directly, but he's quoting it from somebody who's talking about wisdom, which I think is an interesting point. And then this someone else, according to Douglas Campbell, could very well be that Jewish teacher whom Paul is criticizing in Romans 2. Which, if we accept that, and that for me is certainly just as important as any other interpretation and should be placed on the table when we discuss a mixed text, let's look at all interpretation. And this one is a very solid scholar of Douglas Campbell, so why not? So if we accept his viewpoint and we follow that logic, that means Paul is expressing in Romans 1 these very harsh things he's saying. But in actual fact, he's quoting that person in Rome who said it before. Remember, this is a letter that's been an exchange of correspondence. We're only seeing one part of it. We're not seeing what came the other way. So Paul is responding to something that has come from Rome. So his considerations could be quotations from what was coming from Rome, and then in chapter 2, he's pointing out how flawed this all is, and how much he disagrees with it. That's what you'll see in chapter 2. Paul's taken radical. He swings in a very different direction in chapter 2. So all of that complexity, I think you can follow me now, to agree with me there, that there's a lot of different things happening in and around Rome. If you want more details, this is a good place to go. I'm discussing it there. So, and here comes yet another scholar basing himself on the others we've just been talking about. His name is Nings from Denmark, and I'm suggesting here that we accept then the points that have been raised, that the events described occurred in the past. That is obvious, as far as I'm concerned, from the way the text is written. It's held in the past tense, okay? I would also like to say that Paul is not a simple person. He's a sophisticated writer who uses different ways to engage his readers. Pardon?
By no means.
It's all crystal clear, right? I know. He's very, he has different layers, different dimensions in his text. In fact, to be honest with you, when I was working this, my respect for Paul was growing. But I used to actually, do I really want to go there? The yucky stuff. I think he was probably more educated, more sophisticated than many realize. And I'm also concluding here as my point 3, that Paul is basically unconcerned about what we call same-sex erotic activity. What he does care about, and you can see that in the final chapters of Romans, he makes that point very clear, that he really cares about unity, because he can see that the community in Rome is divided very strongly between those from Jewish backgrounds and those who came in with Gentile backgrounds. And I mean, we all know, we probably know examples from your own lives and from your own context, how different groups, factions, they take different approaches, and one feels they're better than the other, and all that stuff. But we all see that, aren't we? So, Paul is concerned about this division in Rome. This is part of the underlying concern of the whole letter. That there is there's this Jewish, I was supposed to say Jewish lobby, but I don't mean it that way. There's this Jewish faction and the Gentile faction who disagree on many things. Now, let me summarize. Christianity has defined same-sex love as unnatural acts, rebellion, sin, perversion, crime, destruction, name it. And Christian tradition has used Romans 1 in this debate, turning it into a text of terror, or some people call it clobber text, which is basically the same thing. Now, summary 3. Romans 1 clearly echoes the book of wisdom, sometimes called the book, Solomon, Wisdom of Solomon. That's the other name it has. Very probably was not written by Solomon because he was composed in Greek, and I believe that was not one of his languages. Now, what is very, very strongly present in the book of wisdom, as it is in the prophets, is a denunciation of idolatry. All the excesses and all the errors that follow from idolatry. That's a strong concern in the book of wisdom. In Romans 1, the verses 26 and 27 refers to a group of people who lived and acted in Rome in the past. In Rome, I should even say. So the sexual activities that are described there, in somewhat unusual language for us, they are associated with pagan temples in Rome, of which there were many. The women may have, I can't say they did because it wasn't there, but may well have practiced anal sex with their men, because this happens within a group of people. And the men seem to have engaged in sexual orgies that were so wild that it caused a social and political scandal punished by the Roman Senate. Now, I'm also suggesting, and I'm leaning here on Douglas Campbell, the one with the 1,100 pages, that Paul, in Romans, I haven't written Pablo, I'm sorry about that. I'm also doing a Spanish version, so sometimes that's a crossover. Paul indirectly cites statements made by a fanatical Christian teacher with a Jewish background who lives in Rome. And, just as importantly, the apostle strongly distances himself from these views expressed in Romans 1, rebuking the teacher in Romans 2. In fact, Romans 2 begins with, "Therefore you who live in Rome are no better than the people you're criticizing." Ten conclusions to finish on. Romans 1, 26 and 27 refer to idolatry, scandalous group activities, and past events. Second conclusion. The rhetoric used in Romans 1 echoes the book of wisdom. Third conclusion. The condemnation that Paul expresses in Romans 1 is not part of his own theology, but reflects somebody else's views. The polemic in Romans 1 and 2 is addressed to a rather fanatical person described as an instructor or teacher with Jewish roots who lives in Rome and is involved in the Roman community, the Roman Christian community, to whom the letter is addressed. Fifth conclusion, in Romans 2, Paul is rebuking this Roman teacher who is wasting his time criticizing idolaters. This is very important. Many people have overlooked this fact. Verses 1, 26 and 27, regardless of their context and what they mean, they are not addressed to Christians. They're referring to idolaters, people worshipping other gods, practicing other religions. They do not refer to Christians. And then I'm going to show you two images, what is not being referred to in these verses, which is obvious, which obviously follows from what I've just been saying. This is not part of it. And this is not part of it. Eighth conclusion. Paul does not share the views held by Christian tradition, supposedly based on Paul. Ninth conclusion. In this letter, Paul has a strong concern to encourage respect between the Jewish faction and the Gentile faction among the Christians in Rome. You can see that in the final chapter. It's the main issue is that one. And Paul is not seeking to exclude certain groups of people. He seeks to include both of these factions, making them live together and accept each other. I would like to finish with this quotation from Romans 16. We're now in the final chapter. Look at the concern he is now expressing here. I urge you, brothers and sisters, to keep an eye on those who cause dissensions and offenses in opposition to the teaching that you have learned. Avoid them. Further questions? Feel free to browse my book whenever you're ready. So, how are you doing? I didn't see too many eyes. Oh.
There were no droopy eyes.
All right. Well, thank you for keeping them open. Yes, I will take a few questions.
Is the main, or one of the main reasons why you don't think that this passage in chapter 1 is addressing Gentile Christians because it's in the past tense?
Yes. Exactly. We saw one verse they're using the present tense, which blurs the whole situation tremendously. So I am, from a literary point of view, and the fact that Paul is using past tense, and very specifically so, for me, he says he's referring back to something that the Romans have heard about that happened in the past. And for me, it's the logical way to interpret a text. When it's past tense, he's referring to past events. So these are pre-Christian events, I would even say, because he's writing a very young, fledgling community that was founded there 2 years earlier only. So, but obviously the events he's referring to, I get, or at least that's my guess, are part of the heritage in Rome. People have heard about this before, so they can probably make the connection we're not able to make because we weren't there. But they were so scandalous, these events, that they went down in history. And Livius, the Roman historian, has written about the Bacchanalia in particular. Right.
And those events epitomize idolatry.
Absolutely. Because the Bacchanalia were dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine, and they got a bit out of hand sometimes. And the other festival, the cult dedicated to Cybele, she was a goddess from Asia Minor who got imported into Rome and became quite popular. And her festival were pretty wild. It was pretty wild too. And worshippers would whip themselves into a frenzy. And sometimes the men would castrate themselves at the end of the ceremony. And that would make them then candidates to become priests, because she wanted castrated their priests. And maybe, I'm conjecturing now, but maybe that is the pharaoh Paul is referring to when in their own bodies they suffered punishment for the error, because I mean, that's a fairly visible consequence, isn't it, of an error?
Pretty heavy-duty error.
Pardon?
I said a pretty heavy-duty error.
I would say so, because if you regret it a year later, well, too late, mate, you know. So all of those, at least those possibilities are there. For me, as I said earlier, it's important to bring them out and put them on the table when we're discussing this text, because far too long there's been a single way of reading it, and Paul is too complex for that. There's so much else in there.
Well, in the aorist tense, it's very clear that not only is it referring to something in the past, an act of the past, but it's even stronger in that it's an act that has been fully complete.
Yes.
It's not something that is started and continues on.
That is true.
Aorist is a past event that is a full, complete act in and of itself. So it's
Yes.
even stronger than
It
that.
does change everything.
Yeah.
It changes the whole perspective. These are past events that are done and over with, and we know what happens, and we know the consequences.
It's a specific event that he's referring to.
Yes,
Not a generalization.
very much so. And even in the Book of Wisdom, when they discuss idolatry there, and as I've been pointing out, there's strong resonances between Romans 1 and Wisdom. Even there, they are also referring back to past events, particularly the events in Egypt, that the idolaters of Egypt, whom they left behind when they moved out of Egypt, when they were with the Exodus. So all of that, the past, is very clearly emphasized in the Greek. But unfortunately, many modern versions of the Bible, some will put it in the present tense, and some will put it in the perfect, saying God has given them up,
Yeah.
and they have exchanged, also implying this comes pretty close to the present time.
Yeah.
So, for me, grammar is essential here. Well, stick to your grammar book then,
Yeah.
and don't philosophize too much, because you get into hot water here. And so we are not being helped much by, I would say, a large number of translations in this text. And don't get me wrong, I'm not in the business of knocking back the translators at large, because there's no reason to do so. But these texts in particular show how often we human beings are influenced by a long-held cultural prejudice. And, translators are human beings like you and me. We also absorb many ideas from the culture in which we grow up. So, and that shows in these texts in particular. Right.
That's huge. I mean, if I don't walk out of here with anything else today, that's just huge in terms of looking at that passage.
Right.
It's just absolutely huge.
Right. Thank you. It is a major issue from many points of view, and sometimes people ask me, fairly recently, a Roman Catholic man in the audience said to me, well, how come that for 2,000 years the church has been ignorant of this, and you come along now, why should I believe you? And I thought for a second, I think, well, one part of my answer would be this. In my lifetime, I've seen a major shift when it comes to free speech. Where I grew up, etc., LGBT people had no free speech. Those were the kind of people you would talk about, but definitely not to and with in public. That was not happening. But this shift has happened in my lifetime. So I would say for the last 40 years, maybe roughly, in the Western world, LGBT people have acquired or gained free speech. Now we can express ourselves. And I, belonging to that group according to current classifications, maybe in 200 years we find a better one. I don't know. But I'm not able to say what this text has done to me, the pain and discomfort I felt, or these texts I should say, and how I feel there's a better way of interpreting them, but only now. So that explains partly the question that the man, yeah, he was right, I mean for 2,000 years, but nobody dared to. Because there was one church for hundreds of years, and he was married to the state throughout the Middle Ages. So there was very little space for debate, if any. said there probably were a few people said, well, can this really be true? But where would they go? They didn't have a pulpit, they didn't have a lecture anywhere. So this is a very recent thing. Finally, we're able to pick that one up and say, hey guys, we can do better than that. Yes.
Well, also, I mean, what is interesting about this is that we have all these references scripturally to homosexual and lesbian behavior or same-sex sexuality. But it seems to me that there are plenty of references to divorce and remarriage, and that the modern church seems to be ignoring. You know, I mean, if we took all the citations, and especially from the Gospels, Jesus didn't speak any of this stuff, you know, but he did speak about divorce and remarriage in the Gospels. But how come there's no big bandwagon, you know, beating the drums about, you know, pushing down on that? I mean, I don't know of any. Maybe in the Catholic Church everybody's quiet, don't ask, don't tell. And in the Roman Catholic Church it is. In the Protestant churches it's just like, come on in, you know. So there seems to be a kind of, you know, forked tongue thing going on here.
Depends on whose ox is being gored.
Yes, yes, I agree. People have a way of being very selective about the issues that they come. And the one that's comfortably away from me, that's the easy one. To say, oh, those people, they're not good enough. You know, but the closer they come to you, the more uncomfortable it gets.
Yeah.
So that is one reason why LGBT issues have been singled out, because they're a minority. So there's a comfortable majority always who can do whatever they like. And only now we're seeing, well, minority, well, it depends on how we define the word minority, right? Because most of us are probably, in some context or other, part of a minority. Nationally, culturally, sexually, etc. So, you know, things are finally beginning to change a little bit, by the grace of God, I would say, because I'm a happy Christian, having seen this whole shift taking place in my own lifetime. I remember very well in my younger days, you know, when there were certain subjects you wouldn't mention even in public, right? And maybe in private with a good friend whispering in their ear and that sort of thing. The first time I heard the word homosexuality spoken in public, I was 21 years old. And I still remember the audience I was in, you know, oh, he said that word. That was 1966.
Yeah.
Since that time, we've heard it a million times, right? But in those days, oh, that was unusual. So things have moved a lot.
Well, we're in the same generation. I'm a couple of years older than you, 72 this month. And I had no idea that gay relations even existed till I got to college and watched what was going on around me. And I thought, I had no idea.
Right.
I remember the first time I ever saw the word, let alone hear it, was Time magazine. I think it was maybe 1970s, maybe 69. On the cover, had the word homosexuality across the cover and kind of a silhouette of a man or something there. And I didn't know what that was, and I was in middle school. So I go to my mother who was well-educated, a psychiatric nurse at the time, and also very engaged with the civil rights movement in the 60s. So I bring the magazine to her and I said, Mom, what is homosexuality? And she says, this is how she answered, this was the nature of the time. She said, Peter, if a man comes up to you in a car and opens the door and invites you to come in the car, turn around and run as fast as you can. So it was like this ominous, from an educated, forward-thinking person, this is what my exposure to homosexuality was, that these were predators going about and I had to watch out. And that was the extent of her explanation.
Probably a Chicago cabinet.
So yeah, it was a different time.
It,
And it's quite amazing to me.
Yes.
And I came of age and was ordained in the late 70s to be in pastoral ministry.
Yeah.
And we never talked about it in our seminary education. It was never anything, I had never expected all of this, that I would be dealing with people and parishioners that who had a different sexual orientation than the norm. We were totally unprepared for this kind of thing. But I had a pastoral sense, starting in the early 90s, that that it was somehow wrong to exclude. I did not understand homosexuality, but I understood that it was against my conscience to exclude someone from the life of the church.
Right.
Discriminate. I knew that was wrong.
Right.
And
Kind of like Jesus taught.
yeah, that's right. And so I have come a long ways myself, but it's remarkable to see the rest of the culture. And when we decided in 1996 to become an open and inclusive community, and an affirming community, we made a deliberate decision to do that here at St. Matthew's. It was a very worrisome thing because I knew we would lose parishioners. But we decided to go down that path, and indeed we lost some people. It was high risk, and we didn't know that the culture was going to continue to progress.
Right.
That we might have painted ourselves in the corner as a community.
That's true.
But now we can see as events are happening, we were on the right side of history, even though we were a minority at that time.
Yes.
You know, this reminds me of something because of what you just said, the right side of history. In 1968, the Roman Church damaged its credibility by Humanae Vitae, publishing it, and it did. It damaged it quite a bit.
Was that an encyclical?
Yes, condemning the use of artificial contraception. And so Humanae Vitae was on human life, and its average Catholic who was very devoted, into the teachings of the church, when it came down, when that came out in '68, people were very skeptical, and over that issue, it lost credibility and sometimes lost membership because of that, at least in the Western world. This issue now, which is gaining in the secular world, the notion of equality of people who are heterosexual, homosexual, is creating the same kind of damage among people, I think, of another generation. Because I think while there are plenty of evangelicals still around who are young, there is a question of the church's emphasis on sex in the first place. When I sit with the Buddhists sometimes, and I have people in there who used to be Christian, and who say, well, there was all the rules and regulations and all this kind of stuff, and fighting about the Bible and everything. Yeah, I really like just sitting here, and the Buddhists taught me how to meditate, and I finally found some peace.
Yes.
And so I think, unfortunately, that we have taken this thread of Christianity, its moral teaching, and its mystical life, we've ignored.
Yes.
And so therefore, because this thing falls over here, and this one is, a strength, its credibility again is gone. The church's credibility and relevance to how does that help my life. All it does is lay heavy burden on my shoulders, and you people aren't doing a single thing to lift that burden.
That's right. Thank you for these two contributions. You're both raising important points. One that is just an apropos to the point the Reverend Peter was raising was, it occurred to me, yes, quite a few churches have been afraid to lose members if they take a more inclusive stance. And what they do not realize, and this is to your point, is hundreds of churches have lost members because they were being far too rigid in their traditional interpretation of the Bible. I know people who today refuse to set foot in a church because they felt it's too much. I don't want to hear any of that any longer. I had an overdose as a young person. Thank you. I'm going somewhere else. So they don't take those into account who left years ago because they couldn't handle that discriminatory discourse they were hearing in church, professed by Christians in the name of Christianity. So they have waved goodbye to Christianity, which is a great shame for the reasons you're saying. So they, unfortunately, they have not been, but they are there too. There's
Yes.
thousands of people out there who grew up in Christian environments or felt attracted to Christianity, and then they met a closed door.
The other side of what you're saying is that if
What's
you
that?
become a more inclusive church, you're going to attract new members to replace the
Yes.
old.
Well, that.
I wouldn't be here if this wasn't an inclusive church.
Right.
I wouldn't be in a nation.
Exactly.
Right.
So we lost some, we gained.
Yes.
There's a progression. Absolutely.
I think the biggest problem from the interpretations in that dialogue is that a lot of young people discredit everything in Scripture because of errors in translations, and then how a view that the stream of moral judgment became more important than Jesus' message. And so I think it's if that thing was wrong, then the whole thing
Yeah.
might be wrong.
They've undermined the credibility and the acceptance of the Bible. So now people don't like the Bible.
Right.
And it's really, they don't like the interpretation.
Yes.
And then they miss out on the richness of that biblical
Yeah,
literature.
Yes.
because a majority of the younger generation grew up with, I'm talking the last 15, 20 years, not 50 years ago. Gays, lesbians, transgenders, questioning all. It was like, yeah. So, so that it's not an issue.
Yeah.
When I was growing up in church, we didn't read the Bible, wasn't it? We were quoted pieces of it here and there.
Sorry?
We were quoted pieces of it here and there, a verse here, a verse there, a sermon built around a section or a book, a particular chapter. But we were never invited to sit down and read it. So I didn't do that until I was almost 50, and then I read it. And it doesn't say what people think it says.
And now you know it really doesn't say what people think it says.
Which is good news.
Yes.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Is this a good time to take maybe a 10-minute break?
Okay. Unless, Jim, you wanted to...
No, I just wanted to affirm what you said about the prophetic tradition, because I think we're right in the middle of it here, not just because we're proclaiming inclusivity, but because in the prophetic tradition, the prophets always called people back to they were defocusing. They were focusing on the wrong things.
Yes.
Like you're focusing on the worship and the festivals and all this stuff, and you're the blessed ones because you do all this stuff. Meanwhile, all this stuff you're missing.
Yes.
And it seems to me that we're right in the same place right now. The whole thing about economic justice and the fair of the earth and all that stuff, and love of neighbor and all that. And we're focusing on these rules over here and on what kind of sex you do.
Right. The biblical message the situation keeps being repeated.
Exactly. Very prophetic.
Right.
All right.
Good. I love it. Let's take about 10 minutes and we'll come back for a round break.